Welcome to the Pandemic Baseball Book Club. I'm Andy McCue, author of Mover and Shaker, Walter O'Malley, the Dodgers and baseball's westward expansion, and the newly issued Stumbling Around the Bases, the American League's mismanagement in the expansion eras. But today, we're privileged to talk to Judith Hiltner and James Walker about their new biography of Hall of Fame broadcaster Walter Red Barber, published by the University of Nebraska Press. Judith and Jim, welcome.
Great to be with you.
Good to be here.
Well, good. So tell me, what led you to Red Barber? Jim, I kind of know why you were there. Jim, for those of you who are not aware, has done a lot of excellent writing on baseball on the radio and television. Judith, you've been more Herman Melville and Philip Freneau. What got you to Red Barber?
What teams did they announce for again? I've forgotten that.
Yeah.
You're right, the American Revolutionaries and the whaling industry, right?
Well, that's a good question, Andy, and I'm certain it was because of my lifelong interest in biography. My background is in literary research, but whenever I was studying or researching or writing about an author, I was always interested in reading the biographies of that author. It just is true that the more you know about the facts of the life and the times of an author, the more deeply you can appreciate and really understand their work. So Jim clearly here is the expert in broadcasting and baseball, but I was eager, I think, to write the stories of a man's life from beginning to end. And it turned out to be, the more I read, the more interesting and compelling his life became.
Mm-hmm. What did you find most interesting about him?
Well, I probably did write more about his personal story, and Jim wrote more about his professional story. But I was interested. He seems to me to be a man who really was committed to fathoming and exercising his talents. And when he wasn't, he kept searching and growing. And that he was, as he said, he was in love with the English language next to human love, and that he really did believe that words put together effectively could change people.
Okay. This is really, I suppose, more a question for Jim, but one of the things that as I was reading the book, and I mean, I knew the broad outlines of Barber's life, but you guys brought a lot of detail to it that I didn't appreciate. But one of the questions that was popping into my mind is, if Red Barber was a 22-year-old coming out of the University of Florida today, could he get a job in broadcasting?
No. I think, well, let's just say that's a flippant answer. The answer is Red was a very driven person. And if he decided he wanted to do something, he would give it maximum effort. So I wouldn't count him out entirely, but it certainly would be more difficult. There certainly are professional broadcasters that make it in broadcasting today, that break through. And I think Red possibly could have been one of those people. So I think there's definitely a chance he would have made it through. It would have been a more difficult route. I mean, Red saw himself as very fortunate, as many of us do as we get older. We're actually feel fortunate about the times that we lived in. And Red felt he came along at the right time. Radio was relatively new. He was able to grow and learn on the job. And he was able to break into baseball broadcasting when it was still in its infancy. And people's attitudes and values hadn't been shaped. It was a lot easier for a younger person to break in those days.
Mm-hmm. All right. In this day and age, of course, he'd be more of a television announcer than a radio announcer. Would that have sat with him, or would he have what shall I say, rebelled against the strictures of contemporary television?
Well, I think it would have been tough for him to start off in television, partly because he was a storyteller, and he talked about how it was that in broadcasting on television, it's the cameraman who basically set the story. You have to talk about what they show, and he said he felt he was losing control of the message in television.
He really thought in radio he was the master, and in television he was the servant of the camera. And he really resented the transition from radio being the dominant medium for baseball to television being the dominant medium. Although he made that transition and he was excellent on television, he really hated that loss of control.
He compared it to writing the narrative for a documentary. You know, the pictures are all there, and you just fill in the words and say what people.
Yeah,
see.
You're just voicing what's on the screen in front of you.
I'm fortunate of being able to spend most of my life listening to Vin Scully, who was one of Red's probably his major disciple over the years, and he always credited Barber with teaching him and bringing him along, and he made that transition as well, and complained in the same way, although to a lesser volume, I think, than Barber did about the transition to television. Talk about their relationship and his whole kind of teaching mode over the years.
Well, Red really wanted to be a college professor when he was working on his degree at the University of Florida before he got into radio, and he really saw himself as a teacher. His mother had been a teacher and a school principal, and he really thought he learned a lot from her, and he clearly saw her as a major role model in that regard. So when Vin Scully came along, a green pea, I believe was what he called him, but one with with something on the ball, as he said. He believed that this was the perfect student, and Vin really was, and he really learned from Red. Sometimes he resented some, because Red could be a very strict teacher, disciplinarian in that sense, and he rubbed Vin the wrong way a few times. But Vin always came back, and in later years really congratulated him on his tutelage, and really credited Red with a lot of the success in his career. Probably more than he should have, given Vin's incredible talent.
Well, he particularly liked the green pea part, because this was somebody who hadn't had any history of radio broadcasting, or at least of baseball. So he could, an empty vessel, he said, that he could fill with doing it the right way.
That's right. And it put him in control, which he really enjoyed.
Now, he also had a long relationship with Mel Allen, and they went together into the Hall of Fame, or really winning the Ford Frick Award together. And yet they were very different broadcasters. And I guess Allen was too well into his career by then to really benefit from Red's teaching, but they did have an interesting relationship.
I think Red had a real sense of hierarchy. His father had been a railroad man, became an engineer, and sort of worked his way up. So he really did believe in hierarchies. And when he came to the Yankees, he had been the top man in Brooklyn, and he was quite comfortable being that person. But when he came to the Yankees, he respected that Mel Allen was the voice of the Yankees, that he had earned that. And so he never saw Allen as a rival. He saw him as a colleague and someone he could compliment. He knew he had a different style. That wasn't going to change Red, and he knew he wasn't going to change Mel Allen. Now, Phil Rizzuto, when he came along, was a little bit of a different story. Pick up on that?
Well, I will say for Mel Allen, he did respect him, but just like when we really, really respect anybody, we can always talk a little bit about the flaws. And he saw Mel Allen as just a bit too much of a homer. And also, he said he's kind of believing in superstition when Mel Allen would never give any indication of what a no, after the fifth inning. And Barber said that he felt like when he broke that unwritten rule, he actually had matured as a broadcaster, because he was committed to telling the truth, the real story.
Yeah, if he had met Mel at the time he met Vin Scully, he would have expected the same kind of development. But he met him as a mature broadcaster, and so it was a live and let live situation.
But talk about Rizzuto. That's kind of a different story.
Oh yeah, well that is a different story because Vin Scully had sort of spoiled Red because he was a willing pupil. Phil Rizzuto was essentially brought in by the sponsor Ballantine after he had retired as a ball player, and they had dismissed a very, very excellent professional broadcaster, Jim Woods, who had a wonderful career and probably doesn't get the due that he should. And Red was very upset about that. Mel was upset about it too, but Red, I think, was especially upset about it. And they brought in Phil Rizzuto. And although he understood the power structure and that he didn't make these decisions, he accepted Rizzuto, and he really tried to help him quite a bit. And in fact, there was some appreciation for his work in the first year or so developing Phil. But Phil had a very different attitude about the job. Phil saw himself as an entertainer. He saw himself as an expert in baseball. He knew he could not compete with a Mel Allen or a Red Barber as a professional broadcaster, and so he went a different direction and became a very entertaining figure and a great broadcaster in his own right, with a much longer career than either Allen or Barber with the Yankees. But he didn't really take direction too well after that first year or so, and in particular, Red was always upset that Phil didn't prepare the way he believed you should prepare. So.
Right. And he would point things out. He would ask Rizzuto on air questions like, "What states surround Mississippi?" or "What states?" or on a Sunday morning, "What did you do this morning?" Well, he wouldn't say, "Well, I just hung out," and then he would go on to say how he went to see an exhibit, an art museum, or the Smithsonian, and kind of put him a little ill at ease. So
so there were times when he wasn't the best possible partner for Phil, and the resentment spilled over a bit, but very rarely. And in fact, Phil, I think, did respect Red as a great professional.
And that was a change in the Yankees. I mean, when he was with Brooklyn, he was able to really choose his partners,
right.
And he wasn't consulted in the choices in New York.
Yeah. Okay. One of the interesting things I thought in constructing the book was the section on Barber's leaving the Yankees. And you presented what happened and then went to the myth, the story that's propagated that he was fired for reporting low attendance one day. Why did you choose to do it that way rather than kind of start with a myth and then go to the facts?
Probably never occurred to me.
Well, I think there is a chronology there. I mean, the facts really never came out. That you could really have the date of the time that he knew he was going to be fired, and the myth of the show the small crowd.
So I guess it probably naturally occurred, because I wrote that particular section. Naturally occurred to me to deal with the facts of the story first, set that up. But then not to ignore the fact that many of the readers, particularly older readers who remember that time, would have remembered some of the myth. And the myth did carry over. And it's pretty well established in baseball lore that he was let go for speaking of the low attendance on the last game of the season, which was, I guess, at the time, the record low attendance. But the Yankees in 1966 were terrible. It was a really miserable day. It was the end of the season. And there's lots of reasons why people wouldn't go to any baseball game on that day. And he really just thought that was the story because it was a record of sorts and he wanted it emphasized. But in fact, the decision to terminate him had been made at least a couple of weeks before that. And there had been inklings of it really since Mel Allen had been let go in 1964. So, but it made a good story.
It did.
It made a good story. Man speaks the truth and he's punished for it. And he moves immediately.
Well, and it's important to note that he himself refuted, in a way, refuted that myth. He didn't actually correct people when they said it, but when they asked him, do you think you were fired for that? He said, no, I don't think it was so much that. He attributed
particularly later,
Yeah.
Okay. Just asked him about that, and he basically said, no, I don't think that was the reason.
Okay. Well, I was a firm believer in the myth until I read the book, so it was it was interesting to pick up what had really happened.
Well, we're the new Mythbusters.
There's a television show in there somewhere.
Yeah, somewhere.
One of the interesting themes that runs all the way through the book is kind of Barber outgrowing or evolving from his Southern upbringing, especially as regards to race. Why don't you talk a little about that, because that's a real core theme in the book.
Oh, it's a really compelling story, and that's why we really start to build the life he had when he was still in the South, and the fact that he, his aspiration was to be a black-faced minstrel player, and he was talented. He learned the songs, he learned the jokes, he learned the dances.
He learned to play a musical instrument.
He talks about later. He talks really about how he was raised. That there was always this line. He said, I had fine parents. They were always polite to all people, but there was always this line between the races, and the line that was there was could not be crossed, and he absorbed that. And so I think he when he got to Brooklyn and Branch Rickey told him, I'm going to bring the first black player to professional baseball. And he said, he came home, he said he was speechless because he was so shaken by that. And it almost seemed like he thought, can I be the announcer of this? And it was partly because he thought, what do I call him? Do I say he's a Negro? What do I say about him? And he was confused. And he also said, how's it going to affect the mood in the clubhouse? Things are going to be different, almost like there was a kind of nervousness and anxiety physically. So, he came home and he told his wife, I'm going to have to quit. And she fortunately said, well, let's have a couple of martinis and we'll sleep on it. And she was reared in the South, but we talk about her experience was quite different. Her first friends were the children of African Americans who worked for the family. And she grew up, they were my closest friends, she said. And so over the years, and moving to Brooklyn, he really had to, at this point, evaluate and question himself and try to get at the core, and he did it diligently. And we kind of traced the process by which he began to accept, and then once he actually met Jackie Robinson and saw the real suffering that he endured, the real insults, he grew to love him. And
also he was blown away, as many people were at that time, with Robinson the player. Yeah. I mean, he was an incredibly great player to report on. And as someone who saw himself as a reporter, a journalist at the ballpark, this was a story, the man's athletic ability, his incredible spirit. And then he certainly witnessed his suffering at the hands of racist taunting.
He had also, around this point in his life, begun to return to his religious faith, and in a very, I would say, broad-minded, ecumenical sense. And he was supposed to give a sermon just around this time. He was supposed to give a sermon at an Episcopal church, because in Scarsdale, where he lived, there was a little conflict at the time between Christians and Jews, and the local minister wanted him to talk, and he wanted him to talk about, and he gave a sermon, Men and Brothers, and he based it on St. Paul, but the whole idea had to do with agape, the Greek term for openness to others, and how we have to treat one another. And he said, when I was writing that speech, I was really not writing about rich people and their conflicts in Scarsdale. I was writing about one Southern broadcaster and one African American coming to realize that they're brothers. And he said that really helped him. And then, there were about 2 years before this happened, before Branch Rickey told him, and Robinson actually came.
Yeah, he certainly had some time to adjust, and Rickey knew that Barber would be the person that people would learn about Robinson.
The Southern voice would help.
The Southern voice would help. The Southern background, which was well known, would help. And his approach was just to report Robinson the player and not talk about racial issue, which of course would have been story one today. But that's really the way most of the New York press also treated his premiere, his first entry into the National League. They really didn't talk about race, or even mention in some cases the race of the player. And so Barber wasn't out of the mainstream in that regard. And Robinson really appreciated that. He didn't want that focus. He knew there'd be enough of that in the air anyway.
And he always said he was thankful. He thanked his wife, and he thanked Ricky for being patient with him, for giving him time to evolve. And the famous statement is, he said, Jackie Robinson did more for me than I ever did for him.
That seems to have been kind of, what shall I say, the first step in a gradual evolution over the years on various issues that came about. Do you think that was difficult for him, or was it just he took the step and then he saw the path and went ahead?
Yeah, I think that's true. He basically he made the transformation, and he had lived in New York for several years before Robert came along, and he had become part of New York society, and he had extensive friendships, and he was a well-known national figure. So I think his attitudes had certainly begun to change before that.
And would continue to evolve.
And would continue to evolve, and particularly his political perspective, where he was very much a kind of Tom Dewey conservative, Republican, kind of a mainstream Republican, I would say, what would have been called mainstream Republican at the time, with some progressive tendencies, definitely, but a belief that individuals should take care of it and the government shouldn't be all powerful and so forth. And he really kind of evolved somewhat in that, particularly in the 60s, and he was very profoundly affected by the Vietnam War.
Yeah. Well, I think partly we learn more about this when he, after baseball, he always felt, as a reporter, as an announcer, he had to just report and tell the facts. But when he started writing, and he did begin to write as soon as he had always published articles in newspapers and independent individual columns, but he actually wrote 3 columns for 3 newspapers during his post-baseball broadcasting years, and there's where we learn a little bit more about the evolution of his values. And he had a lot of more experience abroad especially after he left the CBS job. He was able to travel, and he did USO tours, and he saw a lot more of the world, and he went to Vietnam. And that was the only live war he was actually in, and a very compelling story. But he did say that after the trip, he was certain that we've already lost that war, because of the way the war has demoralized the people who are fighting, who can't even in any way tell who they're shooting at, and it was chaos for him.
Yeah, he wrote his senator, and this is somebody who basically would have thought we might have to have nuclear war with the Russians after they got the atomic bomb. And at this point, he is now writing his senator and saying we need to have a date for an immediate withdrawal from Vietnam. So he switched. He was never. I would never call him a true conservative or a true liberal. I think it depended on the issue, the situation, and the person. He was somebody who believed in individuals. He certainly believed in the individual rather than a particular ideology.
And he had to make other changes, significant changes, because in his personal life. His daughter in the 1950s, late 1950s, came out as a lesbian. And that was something that families never talked about in the 1950s. And that was, I think, a long transition. And we find in his later writings, he's so proud of her. He's so proud of the work that she's done. And he had to, as any parent would, accommodate himself to this, that she wasn't the daughter he thought she was going to be, and she didn't turn out. And she was actually a very active in the gay and lesbian community, and very outspoken. So that was another challenge for him, to learn that kind of acceptance. And over time, he seems they became quite fond of one another.
There's a lot of material that I have seen and that's in your book about his, what shall I call it, mental changeover in regard to Robinson and race in general. I don't see that in regard to his daughter. Clearly, he came to accept it, but he doesn't seem to have ruminated on it in public, more or less, as he did with Robinson.
He did not. Just to give you an example, the one person we were able to interview who did work with Red, Tom Valenti, who had been his producer at the end of his time in Brooklyn, the telecast producer, and he was a wonderful, wonderful source. But when we told him about Sarah, he said, I had no idea about that. I knew nothing about that. Well, so they really kept it private. And I think that probably indicates that they hadn't been won over. And remember, this was, he died 30 years ago. And so what the time we're talking about is 40 or 50 years ago. Attitudes about homosexuality have changed since then. Yes. So he was not certainly somebody who would be an extremist in that era. But it was something difficult to expect, and also at that time, that meant that they weren't going to have grandchildren, right. Which obviously that's not true anymore. But at that time, that was kind of the assumption. So that certainly was something for them.
Well, in fact, everybody we talked to, so many people said, I didn't know that. I never knew about that, and I don't think he ever really made it public at all.
Yeah, Bob Edwards, who worked with him for all those years on Morning Edition on NPR, talked with him every week and visited him on occasion. Said the only inkling he ever got was one time Lila, Red's wife and Sarah's daughter's mother, she asked him, well,
he asked her,
do you think that you'll ever have any grandchildren? Or do you think, and she just said, that's not going to happen.
That's not going to happen.
And then just stopped it and didn't give any explanation. So that's really in all of the research we found the only place other than from Sarah's friends.
We did interview Sarah's friends. A lot of them. She moved out to Santa Fe, New Mexico. Very active gay and lesbian community out there in the 90s, and she, the friends were a source of a lot of information. And they said, Sarah did actually write later in her life that my parents never fully accepted my lifestyle.
Yeah, and I think particularly she saw her mother as not accepting it. I think Red made more of an accommodation based on our reading of the tea leaves. And the real sad thing about our book in doing the research is that Sarah passed away in 2005, relatively young age.
Well, 65, that's young.
Yeah, I think so. Anyway, and as a result, we weren't able to interview her. We really had to get it from things she told friends who are still living in the area. Okay.
The NPR years really kind of put him back very much in the public eye. I wonder about, I guess, he seemed to, all the years in between, he'd been writing and basically completely controlling the narrative. Now he's back in a situation where I take it virtually everything is ad lib, just off the top of his head, depending on questions.
Which he loved, because that put him in control.
Well, let's see. They would call. He was on Friday mornings, and so he'd get a call from NPR from one of Bob Edwards' producers, and they would come up with what would be the general topic the day before. But oftentimes there wasn't any one story that stuck out. Well, it was the obvious choice, so they just winged it. And Bob Edwards talked about how, that was difficult for him. He was a reporter. He was always taught not to give your opinions.
He wanted his script.
And Red would say, what do you think, Bob? What's your opinion? And he said he was somebody who wasn't supposed to have an opinion. So he said it took him a while. Now, we haven't watched those series, but that he, to confirm this, but he said he was uneasy at first. And he just had to learn how to let go and just follow. He became really a good usher to bring Red out.
It was a really good bond, and it was a perfect meeting of personalities to make this really, really rich. And Red would sometimes just drop the topic entirely and move on to what he wanted to talk about. Sometimes nothing related to sports at all. He loved to talk about his camellias and how they were doing, the weather. The cats that he raised, the birds and their activity in the area, that would pop up from time to time, not all the time, but it and people tended to love that because it was so genuine and real. And he was the very articulate, very smart, very wise grandfather who occasionally could go off into a delightful tangent.
Mm-hmm. Now, when he left radio and became a writer, I mean, clearly he had worked with words his whole life and written articles, as you mentioned, Judith. But this was kind of a new discipline for him to really consistently get things down on paper and be organized that way. How much of a difficult process was that for him then?
What's the word he uses?
It's like wearing a hair shirt, I believe.
Shirt.
The most difficult thing I've ever done in my life is writing a book. I think those of us who've written books can sometimes sympathize with that feeling.
Well, he also was an avid public speaker and even became a lay minister and gave sermons. But for his public speaking, he would get thousands of dollars. And here he was getting what? $2.
A pittance,
$100, $150.
His advance for a book from a major publisher might be basically the same as he would get from a speaking appearance or two. And then, all the time it took to do the research and all the writing. And broadcasting, as he said, was great. He could do it. He was fantastic at it, ad-lib broadcasting. And once the game was over, it was over. Good, bad, or indifferent, it was over. And you moved on to the next thing. Writing, he never knew when he was done, and he did rely a lot on his editors. And
in several occasions, he writes about what surprised him about writing, and he always comes up with the same thing. He says, "You don't realize when you sit down and you start moving that pen, you're revealing sides of yourself that you never realized. This isn't what I set out to do, but you learn a lot about yourself." So he felt like writing helped him tap. He was always supposed to be objective and factual. Really, writing helped him discover things about himself he didn't know. So I think it was exciting for him, but really difficult. And he started out much later.
Much later, and he had to learn from editors. He really applauded the editors at the Miami Herald, where he did a column for many years, and then at the Tallahassee Democrat, where he did it for even longer period of time. And his columns are a treasure trove if anybody wants to look at them. They're on newspapers.com, Miami Herald, and the Tallahassee Democrat. And they are a time capsule of sports, particularly baseball, but sports in general during that period of time. And it's fascinating reading it. It's kind of a great historical source. And he himself was seen as almost the early form of baseball reference, in that he would get queries and questions all the time from reporters who just wanted to know the facts. Stuff we look up online quickly now, but weren't readily available then.
We love the column where he says what's wrong with baseball or how baseball has to change. And it's lots of the recommendations that we're still seeing today.
Right. Pitching clocks, speeding up the game. Yeah. More hitting, fewer home runs, fewer strikeouts, things that we're discussing right now.
You talk quite a bit about Barber's legacies over the years. How do you think they have lasted?
Well, I think you could talk about the announcer legacy, that it's passed down through 3 generations.
At least, yeah. I think Pat Hughes, who we quote in the book, the voice of the Chicago Cubs, radio voice of the Chicago Cubs, put it best when he says Red Barber was the most influential baseball announcer in history, and there's no competition, because he schooled Vin Scully. He influenced Ernie Harwell a bit early in his career. He helped develop, even though he was reluctant, he helped develop Phil Rizzuto, Jerry Coleman. These are all Ford Frick Award winners and some of the legends of the game. And then they, in turn, influenced other people. People listen to Scully, and when they're listening to Scully, they're hearing some of Barber as well. So I think the legacy there is well established.
Well, I think he came at the right time when there hadn't really been a whole lot of there weren't textbooks on how to announce, how to remember to say the score, how to do this, how to research, how to prepare, how to have yourself a lot of stories in mind in case it's a slow game and nothing's happening. You can talk about this player and that player, and so it was preparation in a way. Everything that we sort of assume announcers do today, he actually
put it
down, and he wanted to do it. He wanted himself to do it, but then everybody he worked with, he expected them to do it too. So I think he was one of the most influential figures in professionalizing The art of broadcasting sports.
And he wrote this in at least 2 books, one called The Broadcasters in great detail, and in other books. And both John Miller and Bob Costas read these books and cite it in their own work as the influence. Bob Costas read his book, The Broadcasters, when he was in high school. So, I mean, he did something that very few people in that profession do. He actually wrote it down, and he wanted other people to do it the right way, which was his way. And when they didn't, he wasn't too happy about it.
Which made him a little persnickety.
Yes.
Yeah, right. But we also were pleased to find in our research, and wouldn't have predicted this as a legacy, that so many writers claimed that listening to his voice when they were young on the radio at night, the sound of
taught
his voice
them a love of language.
Taught them a love of language, and they write to Red. I wouldn't have written this novel. I wouldn't have written this book if it hadn't been for the beautiful way you use language. That he could call a game and also be so eloquent.
Yeah.
He combined action and beautiful language.
And something Vin Scully could do also. And those are truly gifted people.
They are. I can remember Scully in the middle of play-by-play, not in an anecdote between innings. The Dodgers had a reserve shortstop named Rick Arbach, his nickname was the Crab. And there's a ground ball. Auerbach goes after it, and Scully just says, "And there goes Auerbach, scuttling across the floors of silent seas."
Oh, wow.
Without any reference, without telling you that it's a reference, anything like that, but just using the language beautifully.
Yeah.
And that really, really struck me. Anyway, Judith, Jim, it's been a wonderful conversation. It's a terrific book. I really enjoyed it thoroughly. And best of luck with that. And hope 8 million people buy copies.
Well, there are 8 million people in the Naked City, so hopefully they'll all get a book.
Okay.
Thank you so
Thanks.
much for doing great, engaging questions.
Yeah.
Thank you. A very good interviewer.